And we're back. Thank you once again for joining me in the How to Draw HD Remix tutorial. This is the high definition version of the original How to Draw tutorial. Figured we'd give you something that was visually better, more clear, so that you can actually see more of what we're actually doing here. So the last session we were talking about shading in Adobe Illustrator and getting your character art with some dimension. This time around, we are going to discuss highlights. Now, what I spoke of before was that you can actually flip these two sections. It's completely up to you. Depends on your workflow whether you like to work with the highlights first and then the shading, or you can do the shading and then the highlights. Completely up to you. Almost like PEMDAS or PEDMAS in math, division and multiplication switch. I know you did not want to hear that, nor did I, but it was the only relevant reference I could think of. So you can flip those two operations. It's up to you. So, moving forward, let's take a look at our illustration thus far. We have our color layer, and we have our shading layer, and then we're going to have a lighting layer or highlights. And what we're going to do is we're going to create highlights at the points where we feel the light source is actually hitting the character or in opposition to the darkest of shadows. So if our shadows are on the underneath parts or the creases in between the muscles and or on the left portion, that means to the far right are going to be the points that are actually where our light source hits. So I'm going to turn this on real quick, and you're going to see these are the areas that the light source I have hitting. So we can turn it off and then back on just so you can see this turning off and on. And again, I'm using gradient mesh gradients as well as hard lighting with shapes in this. And if you were not familiar with the last shading course, essentially what you're doing is you're taking any shape. Let's use a sphere in this instance. We're going to turn the lighting off. And let's create a sphere over the character itself. You can use, let's say, we can use this actual shape as our light source, as a hard shape, and that can be used for it. The only problem with that is usually the light source on this type of material, taking texture into consideration, is not going to hit that material hard. It's going to diffuse and be soft. So you either have to use gradient or gradient mesh. But if you were to use it over this as a hard shape, you can use the pen, you can use the pencil, you can use the blob brush. Let's use the blob brush tool. And we're going to create a shape like this. Let's actually turn that white. And it could be any color that's lighter than the color you're using or wants to reflect the light source that's coming. So a yellow or a white would be best. And then you can change the actual opacity of it so that it blends well. And you can change it to screen, or you can change it to lighten or luminosity. I actually like using luminosity a lot. It takes on the colors and the attributes of the item below it, but keeping it lighter in retrospect. So this is one way to do it, and you can do that with hard shadows. You can actually, if you want, you can layer your lighting above it using the same thing. Like you can create other items. Let's say we created that. Let's say we create another one. We move that above. We can change the actual opacity of each of these and their blending mode so that they're relative to one another. And if they're overlapping, you'll notice you'll get different textures underneath using that. So that's one option with hard shapes. The other is to, again, you can use, let's say we did this here and we're using the pen tool really quickly and we wanted to create a gradient. And we can do a radial gradient. Let's say we hit the G button, which gives us access to the live controls on the actual gradient. We can expand it, we can move it, and we can actually change this color here to white instead of the black. And we can change the opacity of that color itself to 0. So that it'll just blend in with the background. And let's actually rotate this, make it more or less, change the direction, drag it down, bring it in here, and then let's scale it proportionally with it. And we can have a light source there. And we can change the transparency. We can change it to luminosity, change the opacity, drop it down, and now we have a softer light source. You can also change the actual distance that that source is coming so that you have it expanding more and outward, a softer effect, a more hard effect. Any way you want to put it, you can do that, and you can manipulate it in the gradients panel itself. You can also change it to linear if you want it. And you can change the direction. Let's say the light source we know is coming from the upper right to the lower left. We can change it to fit within those parameters. Change it so that it's more evenly spread. And then we can spread this out. Take that back. And even soften the opacity some more. And let's see. Now we have a different type of gradient that's set there. You can also change it where, let's say right now we drag this to the middle, the part with the 100% opacity, and then we can copy the 0% side to the other end. And what that does is it gives us a harsh point in the middle with two soft sides. And you can learn to manipulate these across the artwork itself. Now, we also have our other option, which is gradient mesh. And you can use the letter U on your keyboard to create this. And usually you start with a flat color. So we're going to start with just a solid, let's say, white. Now, you know what? We're going to change it to yellow. So let's go here, change it to a yellowish color. And then I want the edge around it to be soft, so I'm going to hit the U key, hit it in the middle, and let me change the color so you can see where these guides are actually at. I'm going to change the color of the physical guide points. And we will change that to, let's say, dark blue. Click OK. And now you can see where these actual anchor points, Bezier curves are, so that you can manipulate them. And we're going to only keep the middle point selected. And we're going to change the transparency of these other points and drop it down. And then we can change the transparency of the point in the middle, but not all the way to 0. And we can lower it, and we can do this independent of one another. You can change any of these points. So remember that when you're using the mesh tool, all points work independent of one another, and it creates a grid of these anchor points, which allow you to change their color, transparency, and blending mode independent of one another. So be very wary of that. So I'm going to select the whole thing. I'm going to click luminosity, and now I get the color attributes of what's below it, and it's only taking on the intensity of that actual shape. And then I can change and lower the actual opacity to get a more realistic, stylized look. See? So you can do things like that, and then you just have to go through individually and set it up in your piece. And you just have to be very, very cognizant of how you're doing that. Remember, be wary of the materials that you're setting this on, because depending upon the material itself, it's going to affect it differently. Now, one of the things we have to start to think about is how harsh do we want our light source? So that's where intensity has to come into play. So we had our light source here, and of course we lowered it a lot, but we're going to have to think about the overall mood of the piece. We may want stronger lights, we may not want it to be luminosity, we may want it normal, and we may want to actually change the color. It's going to vary, and you can get to that a little later, but what you want to do is you want to make sure that all your shadows and all your lighting is set up. So make sure you take a lot of time being very meticulous about this aspect of your piece. And then once you have these set up, you can go back and look at the overall piece and then change the actual colors of the piece itself. So, and when I say colors, I'm talking to the color of the highlights or the color of the shading. All right. If there's a red hue overall, you can do that, or you can, apply an effect that will change the overall tone of the actual piece. So far you've seen each of the techniques for using the highlighting, whether it's a harsh line, whether you're using gradient or a gradient mesh. You can also change blending modes. One of the blending modes that I do like to use a lot, depending upon the color that it's used on, it doesn't really work well in red, is the overlay mode. You can look into things like that. There are a ton of modes: color dodge, screen, lighten, overlay, soft light, hard light. Different modes, different reactions to your actual piece. So you just got to test them out and see where things flow and what makes you feel more comfortable with the overall theme of your piece. All right, so that was our highlighting tutorial. We just did the shading prior to this, and again, you could flip those two, depends on where you want to go with it. Make sure you are very, very careful with the type of texture. This is a bone texture for mine, and then leather, and then metal. So I have to consider 3 different types of textures. And if you look on the spikes for the shading that I did previously and how I would do the highlights, it's going to be a different type of lighting. They're going to be harsh on the metal, where it's going to be soft everywhere else. All right? So take time, flow through this, go back, make sure you look everything over and you're very comfortable with it. And once you're comfortable with it, we'll be moving on to our next section, which is essentially finishing elements of the actual piece. So stay tuned. Thanks again for joining me for this class, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.